Hello, this presentation is on the impact of COVID-19 and online religious gatherings on emerging adult spirituality. Dr. Molly Carter is the research supervisor for this project with research interns Dallas Griffith, Savannah Dunsmore, Unique Early, and Sydney Smith. The findings that will be presented to you are preliminary findings, as we will not be ceasing to collect data until around May the 1st. So, terror management theory states that when we are faced with life-threatening events, people cope in ways that make them feel immortal. Life-threatening events make us aware of our mortality, and so people try to cope in ways that help to counteract that. One way that people try to restore a sense of immortality is by returning to religious beliefs as a coping mechanism when they face the threat of mortality. As we know, COVID-19 has presented life-threatening illness, fitting for studies on terror management theory. Other previous research is on emerging adult spirituality. Emerging adulthood is a time, a developmental period from age 18 to age 29, where emerging adults are often critical of their faith upbringing. And emerging adults either often adopt a more individualistic style of faith or they turn away from their faith of origin completely. So our first research question is, how will the COVID-19 pandemic be related to and or impact emerging adult spirituality, which already tends to be a little bit unstable? And then we are also adding part of our study having to do with online religious gatherings. Social distancing guidelines during the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in many in-person religious gatherings migrating to an online format. These gatherings include religious services, small groups, religious text study groups, discipleship and accountability meetings, and prayer groups. Some emerging adults may participate in any, all, or none of these activities. But we were assessing partially their comfort with these activities as opposed to in person. So our second research question is, how did online religious gatherings impact emerging adult spirituality? There is no prior research on the impact of online religious gatherings. All right, so this study is a mixed method study. The quantitative portion assesses self-reported COVID-19 stress, spirituality and religious sentiments prior to COVID-19, frequency of participation in online compared to in-person, perceived spiritual growth related to COVID-19, and perceived spiritual growth related to online religious participation. The qualitative portion assesses self-reported thoughts and emotions related to COVID-19, coping skills regarding COVID-19, online religious gatherings, and spiritual growth, hindrances, and changes during and after the time of meeting primarily online. In order to participate, individuals had to be age 18 to 29. This study is ongoing, so the preliminary quantitative findings are on 49 participants. So I did use non-parametric statistical procedures for now, and the preliminary qualitative findings have to do with 3 participant interviews. Our measures for the quantitative portion are the COVID-19 stress scales, which assess feelings of danger, contamination, SES consequences, xenophobia, traumatic stress symptoms, and compulsive checking. We also used the Aspires scale short form, the assessment of spirituality and religious sentiments, which measures spiritual transcendence, and the religious index for questions that measure religiosity. I also modified the religious index and added it once again to ask 1 year ago to assess prior religiosity. Other questions that we asked, we made up, having to do with, did your faith community meet online? How did the availability of these technology-mediated religious gatherings impact the frequency of your involvement? How did they impact your involvement with your community of faith, and did it have a positive, negative, or neutral influence on your spiritual growth? So when I did the Spear-Monroe rank order correlations, we didn't find as many correlations yet between spiritual transcendence and the religious index with the COVID-19 stress scale as a whole. We did find that spiritual transcendence and the religious index together are negatively associated with xenophobia. We also found that the religious index alone is negatively associated with xenophobia, and that spiritual transcendence and the religious index together is negatively associated with contamination concerns. In regard to the qualitative interviews, we found three main themes in these three interviews so far. The first one is distractibility. Participants reported that when their participation in online religious gatherings was distractible, that there were things in their home, room, dorm environment that kept them from fully engaging with the service or small group or prayer group or whatever it was. They also said that due to not having in-person gatherings and as much face-to-face interaction, they had to take more responsibility for their own spiritual growth in terms of reading religious texts, praying, and things like that on their own. They also reported, all of them, that since returning to in-person gatherings, their relationships within their community of faith are closer, that the people that they were in community of faith with, those relationships are stronger, and that they feel more connected now that they have returned to in-person gatherings. So overall, from these preliminary findings, we find that there is some individualization that occurred possibly due to online migration during the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of individuals indicated that they had to take more responsibility for their own spiritual growth. This is consistent with what emerging adults do overall when they take the time during this developmental stage to be somewhat critical of their beliefs, but that in this case is not all the story. When they did go back to in-person gatherings, they had gratitude for those gatherings and gratitude for the group members, and their relationships became stronger. This is opposed to what has previously been found in emerging adult spirituality literature. Emerging adults tend to stray from the community of faith, but perhaps due to the pandemic and their religious gatherings not being in person as usual, maybe they were ready to go back to in person and have those relationships be close again. So it could actually serve as a buffer from going to from a more collectivistic orientation of faith to an individualistic individualistic orientation where they kind of stray from that. And then it was interesting to find that people who were high in spirituality and religiosity actually experienced less xenophobia. They were less concerned about people from foreign nations or people who are unlike them. And they were less concerned about contamination overall regarding things like doorknobs, groceries, and things like that being contaminated with COVID-19. The limitations are these are preliminary findings only. We will be continuing the study. We just got approval for the study a couple of weeks ago, and so we haven't had as much time as we would like to gather data. Next is the study is on emerging adults only. Findings cannot be generalized to other developmental periods. Finally, most of the participants in the study reported that their religious preference is Christian, although we did have other people who reported being of the Hindu faith. We had other people report that they were atheist and or agnostic. But primarily it was a Christian sample. That can present limitations, as not all religious groups have such an emphasis on gathering together quite as much as Christians do. We had several references, Arnett and Jensen, Wei Chan, Lau and Chung, Piedmont and Taylor, references that have to do with terror management theory, emerging adult spiritual development, and also for the COVID-19 stress scales and the assessment of spirituality and religious sentiments. Thank you so much for tuning in to these preliminary findings, and we hope to have more to report at a later date.